The Magician's Game. Found in www.creepypasta.org web link. Created by Agrim Auxiliatrix 1. The audience laughed as the young kid had apparently been more than enough to please the crowd. As the man slowly walked away from the almost blindly bright spotlight, he kept his face focused on the crowd, continuing to smile. He attempted to focus on specific members, one being a teenager who appeared to be recording the whole thing's phone, another being a pretty blonde girl with particularly lovely blue eyes. Tom realized that this wasn't helping when he almost tripped on his own feet, and he went back to just smiling and focusing his effort on leaving the stage. After a few moments, the magician was out of the audience's sight. Immediately, he stopped grinning and went to his nearby dressing room. Once the magician had opened the door, he ducked under the doorway and walked inside the cramped room. Closing the door, he let out a sigh. After years of doing the same acts, it was finally starting to tire him out. At this point, he collapsed against the door and sat down for several minutes, thinking. His thoughts were interrupted by a knocking at the door. "Mr. Rolsvik, do you mind if I speak with you for a second? I promise it won't take very long." It was clearly the voice of a young man. He seemed to be rather impatient, for he said his words very quickly. Mr. Rolsvik, being a bit startled by this person, quickly retorted, "What do you want, autographs? Interviews?" "Not quite, Mr. Rolsvik. I have a letter for you, and it is kind of important. I'm supposed to deliver it to you face to face, so can you open up the door, Mr. Rolsvik?" He had received letters before, but something about the way the man worded the sentence gave Mr. Rolsvik an uncomfortable feeling. Why would a letter need to be delivered face to face? Shrugging it off as just odd phrasing, Mr. Rolsvik sighed and opened the door. In front of him was a young man in a clean suit and with a slicked back haircut. With that hair, he looked a bit like an even skinnier version of Elvis in the 50s. "I'm busy, kid, so just hand me the letter so I can get back to work," the magician grumbled. "Mr. Ills. Just call me Tom." "Well then, Tom, you were just sitting against the door, staring off in deep thought. I wouldn't really classify that as work." "Just give me the damn letter," Tom said, getting impatient. "All right, fine. I wish you good luck and goodbye, Mr. Tom Rolsvik," the man stated, and with that, he strolled off. As the man walked off, Tom suddenly realized how peculiar that conversation was. How did the man know that he was leaning against the door? Why did he wish him good luck? Maybe this letter can explain something. Tom muttered to himself, eyeing the letter. The writing on the front of it was very neat, and there was no stamp or address. The writing stated, "Stop examining and open the letter." Finding it odd that the letter would know of his actions as he was doing them, Tom started to feel uneasy. He flipped to the back of the letter to find more neat writing, stating, "You are a bit slow. Care to be a bit faster?" Tom was now incredibly skeptical as to what was going on. Being unable to put aside his curiosity, Tom ripped open the letter. Inside was a very neatly folded piece of paper. Unfolding it quickly, Tom began to read the handwritten note. "Hello, Mr. Tom Rolsvik. I can understand that you are confused, but please put that aside for now. There are more important matters at hand. Since you have opened this letter, you have just began a bit of a game. I certainly view it as a game. After all, games are fun, aren't they? The ultimate objective of the game is very simple, winning, by any means possible. Losing the game will result in, well, you'll see if you lose. Trust when I say that this is a grand chess game. This letter was the first move. Time for you to make the next one. E4. Tom stood in complete shock. Game? What the hell is this? Tom said aloud, kind of hoping for some sort of hint at what was happening to him. Looking down at the letter, Tom realized that there was some writing on the back. Tom was unsure if he wanted to flip it over, but he was also rather exhilarated. Finally, he was doing something different and new, rather than performing the same tricks day after day, show after show. Tom liked the feeling, and he didn't want to see it go to waste. He flipped over the letter. On the back was 2 sentences. I knew you couldn't resist. Make your chess move and let's begin. At this point, Tom was starting to get over the shock of the paper knowing what he was saying before he even started saying it. Tom flipped to the front and took out a pen. E4 had to be chess notation. Tom carefully wrote, D5. Nothing happened. Tom sat down and waited impatiently. Something would happen in time. Within a minute, there was a knock at the door. Tom went to the door with excitement and opened the door. However, the setting was completely different. On the other side of the door was a completely white tiled room. In the center were polished black chairs and a table. On the table was a chessboard, with the pieces already set up. Sitting in one of the chairs was a person that he couldn't quite make out. Tom couldn't even believe what he was seeing. The cramped backstage had been replaced with this odd, bright room. Tom shut the door and opened it thinking that his eyes might have just been fooling him. Opening the door again, the room was still there in the exact same condition. Tom walked in slowly, closing the door behind him, getting closer to the man and the table. As he got closer, he noticed the man had a very thin beard, a very smooth face, and green, piercing eyes. Funny, he looks a bit like... Tom started to say before he realized something. The man was him. Tom's eyes widened as he stared in shock. The man had all the same physical features as Tom, as well as the exact same outfit. So, shall we play? The duplicate said, grinning as he stood up and pulled out a chair for Tom. Go ahead and call me whatever you like. Is Dibaru okay? I've always liked that one. Tom was still dumbfounded by this replica of himself. Tom looked behind him and noticed that there was no longer a door. Sitting down, he decided that he had to know what was going on. What are you? Tom asked. What do you think? I'm you. But how is that possible? Have you ever considered that you always had a double that knew all your thoughts? One that knew every single thing you were going to do, and every single thing that you have done? We can keep talking, but first I'll make my move. Pawn to f3. The pawn moved forward by itself. Tom began to speak again. Alright then. But if you know every move that I am going to make, then how can I win? That is for you to figure out. Go ahead and try. Tom said nothing. Hello, Tom? Dibaru speaking, you have been taking a bit too long to make your move. Go on. Tom sighed and began to play once more. Knight to c6. Tom watched as his knight moved to the correct spot. Excellent. Knight to c3. Tom started processing his possible options as Dibaru sat there. You're going to say f1, Tom. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say pawn to f5. Tom realized just how difficult this challenge would be. Pawn to f5. Tom stuttered quietly. Pawn to g4. Tom thought about distracting him with conversation. So, how are you formed? I'm not listening. But you know my thought. I'm ignoring any thoughts that have nothing to do with the chess game. Go on, please. What if I don't? Well, you can't exactly leave, as you noticed that there really isn't a door anymore. Sighing, Tom opened his mouth and said, pawn to e4. I say pawn to e4 as well. Tom's next move was interrupted by a scream of, "This is just so boring." What? I'm playing the game. Well, this game sucks. It always took so long and there was nothing to occupy the player as they did it. So, let's spice it up, shall we? Dibaru said. He snapped his fingers and the chessboard fell through the floor. The room collapsed around him as the ceiling flew away above Tom. Tom still thought this was very strange, but he was starting to get used to the oddness. The rest of the room continued to be deconstructed as the chairs simply disintegrated. Tom stood up as Dibaru stood up as well, laughing hysterically. God, you're going to love this. Now, make your move. How am I supposed to do this without the board? Memory, obviously. My memory is only as good as yours is, so this should be fun. The room had finally disappeared to reveal where they actually were. They were on the top of a moving train, chugging along a mountainside. Nibiru laughed even harder as he saw Tom's expression. "Come on, then. Make your move." Pawn to g4? Lovely. Knight to d5. The train was accelerating. "Do we have to keep doing this, Tom? Make your move." Pawn to a5. Nibiru pulled Tom back up to his feet, smiling. Pawn to d3. Tom was finally starting to get fed up. "Just leave me alone. I'm just a magician that wants to live his life, not deal with this bullshit." "Oh, but I thought you were tired of being a magician? Doing the same tricks, over and over? Doing all those rabbit things," as the audience laughs at how very quickly people love my acts. Love for how hilariously terrible they are. Have videos such as, Magic Fails, Worst Magic Trick Ever, and, my personal favorite, Tom Olsvik, the Magical Fuck-Up. Shut the hell up. Tom was absolutely teeming with rage and anger. One more comment, and that would push him over the line. "Hey, guess what, Tom? I think you've made another fuck-up. This one might be quite magical as well." That one set Tom off. Tom charged straight ahead for Nibiru, yelling and swearing the whole time. Nibiru waved his attack off, laughing. "You've been so caught up in this that you haven't even realized that this train is about to drive off a cliff." He heard his bones shattering, before finally hearing nothing. Tom woke up in his bed to a knock on his bedroom door. Yawning, Tom ignored the nightmare he had just had and asked, "Who is it?" "Lisa, dear." Tom smiled as he opened the door and let his wife through the door. She looked lovely with her luscious blonde hair. She had already prepared breakfast for him. "So, how was the show last night?" "It went well. The audience seemed to enjoy it quite a bit." Suddenly, Tom realized something. He didn't have a wife. Lisa grinned. "They probably loved all of the mistakes you made. I expect the next part of that epic video saga." Tom Olsvik, the magical fuck-up, her skin tearing off to reveal her organs, completely changing and mutating into different shapes and sizes. Blood leaked out from everywhere, and Tom couldn't bear to watch it. Finally, Tom looked back and saw the skin reforming into the old familiar face it was. His face. "So, she was one of your audience members. I noticed how you thought she was pretty, so I figured she would have been the best choice." Nibiru grinned immediately after stating that. Tom, still horrified at what he had just witnessed, stared in disgust and awe. "Oh, don't keep doing that. We have a game to finish, after all. This time, I'll even give you the board back." Tom's bedroom quickly fell apart to change back into the white-tiled room with the black table and chairs. However, this time, something was different. There was a noose hanging off to the side of the table. What is with that? "Oh, it is very simple. You considered this a dream previously, but it is rather obvious that this is just the breakdown of your mental psyche." What? Come on, the stress and the boredom of your magic routines was getting to you, and you know it. I knew you were this great big waste of a magician because you already knew that yourself. You just kept avoiding it and suppressed the memory, trying as hard as you could to forget. "So? Pawn to h5. "Oh, so you're playing again, are you? Alright, let's do this then. Bishop to g5. Nibiru sat back down in the chair as the bishop moved across the board. Tom uneasily sat back down as well. "Answer my question. What are you trying to say?" "Pawn to e6. "Well, you reached the breaking point. Your mind, deteriorating faster and faster, is hallucinating left and right. So, when you fell off that train it possibly exist." Tom said nothing and held his head down. "Your reality is breaking down because you are accepting your inevitable fate. Your own suicide. What do you say to that, Mr. Olsvik?" Tom slowly lifted up his head, took a look at Nibiru, and decided what he needed to do. King to d8. Nibiru sat in silence as the king moved. Knight to f4. The noose appeared to be getting closer. Bishop to h3. Pawn to h3. Queen to g4. The noose was now almost touching the table. Pawn to e5. Queen to g5. You're in check, Tom. Tom suddenly stood up on the chair and looked beside him. The noose was right there in front of his face. I will win this. I have to. King to d7. I'm sorry, but you were fated to lose from the start. You did it to yourself, Tom. Pawn to d4. Knight to d4. In 4 moves, I will win. Queen to e5. Tom lifted his hands up to the noose. Knight to f3. Queen to e6. Check. Noboru looked straight at him, not with a grin, but with a grimace. Tom sighed heavily. He knew that this was his last move. Nothing he did would get him to win. Putting the hole around his neck, Tom closed his eyes. King to d8. Rook to d4. Checkmate. Tom stepped off of his chair. As he breathed his final breath, he heard the Baru say one final sentence. This was the grand chess game of your life. And that game is over. Necrophilia. Located in www.creepypasta.org web link. Credit to Broke Melodies in my head. I've always loved the dark. It feels warm and welcoming. Like a mask, hiding all the stress and emotion that the daylight shows so explicitly and replacing them with a sensuous feeling. The dark reveals your true nature and abolishes the facade you play during the daytime. Yes. The dark is good. You can be yourself in the dark and not feel judged or threatened all the while by being yourself. That's why I love the night so much. You can just relax in the blackness, surrounded by nothing but shadow. Allowing the dark to overcome your senses and numb them down until you feel nothing at all but complete weightlessness. Then, when sleep finally takes control, you are thrusted into even deeper darkness. Infinite darkness. Just black empty space. An endless void your mind creates to help you drift off into unconsciousness. But why? Why is it always black? Have you ever thought about that? Whenever we close our eyes, we are met with black. But why? You don't notice it, do you? You don't think about it. It's just there. Like breathing, blinking. After a while your subconscious just accepts that when we close our eyes, we see darkness. Empty darkness. Why is it then that people are scared of the dark? An average human being will sleep for 229,961 hours of their lifetime. For 1/3 of their life, they will live in darkness. Complete and utter darkness. If we really were scared of the dark, why do we have the ability to close our eyes and sleep for so long? So long in the black oblivion. You see, I think no one is truly afraid of the dark. That's just an illusion. An illusion we produce to trick ourselves into thinking that there is no such thing as monsters. We've all heard that story, haven't we? About the night terrors that roam around in the night, claws raised, teeth bared, ready to attack the young, naive child as they sleep in their beds, unaware of their demonic presence because they can't see them. Don't lie to yourself, you were like that once. Sitting awake, clutching at the sheets as you stare at your ceiling or glancing around your room. Perhaps you had a night light. A holy crucifix of sorts that were used to ward off the monsters. To protect you. Well, I think, as you grow up, you begin to tell yourself that in all your childlike innocence, you were never scared of the evil that lurked in the shadows, you were simply afraid of the dark. That's what you believe. As you grow up, you tend to grow out of this fear and relish in the dark like I do. But this fear can remain with you in adulthood. In fact, it's one of the most common phobias, nyctophobia. Even as a fully matured adult, you still fear the emptiness. Or do you? You see, the statistics prove that we spend a long time sleeping. A long time in the dark. We never seem to mind, even if we are terribly scared of that darkness. But why? I think your subconscious is telling you that they are still there. A small part of you still holds strong on your childhood memories of being alone in the dark with the night terrors. But this time, you have no light to guard you. Obviously adults don't tend to own those little night lights anymore, do they? They say they don't need them anymore. They call it a silly childhood fear of the dark. They say there is no such thing as night terrors. But what do they know? If they lived long enough to mature into adulthood, they've probably never seen one. My opinion is that we all have nyctophilia, a general love for the dark that helps us sleep. Even those that claim they have a fear for the night. They love the dark. I love the dark. You really were never scared of the dark. It really was an illusion our minds created to reassure ourselves we are safe at night. To reassure us that there are no such things as night terrors. I love the dark. I always have. It feels homely, warm and comforting. Like I've always been in the dark. It's fun being in the dark. Feeling free. Feeling safe. I know you like the dark too. When you come home from work, tired and tense, and you flop onto your bed, stretching your aching muscles, getting ready to sleep. Yes. You love the dark. I know. You still fear it though. An occasional scan around your room before you allow your body to shift into sleep mode. It's amusing, really. You know damn straight what you fear and it ain't the dark. It's me. I like watching you sleep. The way you toss and turn, the way you sigh constantly when you get comfortable. The way you jump up in surprise when you hear a noise. You haven't changed much from when you were a child. Not really. You still fear me. But this time, I'm not going to let you get away. You are unprotected now. No nightlight. No nothing. Completely and utterly alone in the dark. With me. I've always loved the dark. So have you. Good night. Sweet dreams. The Gift. Found in www.creepypasta.org web link. Original author, Seabass was here. A true story. When it all began, I was a lonely 7th grader at a large public school. I had few friends there, and even these friends of mine bullied and mistreated me more often than not. So I made my friends at church. At this point in my life, I was deeply religious, even at such a young age. I prayed and read the Bible daily, and my family regularly attended church. However, no matter how much effort I put into my religion, I always felt a great distance between me and God. I could spend all day praying, but every time I tried, I still felt like I was talking to the wall. How could I know he was there at all if I couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, couldn't feel him? But my father, oh, he could hear God just fine. I knew because he had seen them, seen the angels. My father and my mother, still married at this time, disagreed upon many issues, especially religious ones. So as the tension between them grew, my father turned to other sources of fulfillment. He began taking long walks each day, during which he would spend hours praying. He developed a kind of distant look in his eye, which constantly hinted at the fact that he was occupied with things outside our world. This only increased the tension in the household, as my mother accused him of being neglectful of household chores and duties. Then, when he and I were doing yard work one day, my father revealed to me his gift. "Son, this may sound strange at first," he told me, nervously clearing his throat, "but I had a vision from God." He then began to describe to me his vision. Jesus had led him to the top of a high mountain overlooking the whole world. Upon the mountain, Jesus told my father that he was sending him out as his servant to win back the world for the cross. My father resisted, claiming he did not have the gifts to take on such a task. Jesus then told my father that he was going to give him a special ability to aid him, the ability to see and communicate with spiritual beings. This would help my father complete his task. Still my father resisted, saying he was not worthy of such power. Jesus, becoming angry, swiftly brought my father down to the depths of hell. My father looked upon the lake of fire. Thousands of souls were drowning in its flames, wailing in agony. Their skin was bubbling and dripping off in large clots from the intensity of the heat, the hair was completely singed off their heads, their bloodshot eyes burned red from the flaming tongues that continually licked them. My father grew sick to his stomach. "Do you see this?" Jesus said to him. "This is what will happen if you do not act soon. If you refuse to obey your calling, you shall be responsible for the eternal death of millions." I was speechless. But that was not all. My father then went on to tell me that in the days following the vision, he had begun to see the angels, just as Jesus had said he would. They're everywhere. They're invisible to human eyes, but I can see them. Dozens of them. They're the most majestic creatures. I had no idea what to say. How could I know, when my father had actually just told me in all earnestness that he suddenly had the power to see angels and spiritual beings? Was I losing my mind? Was this a strange dream? Yet, even as insane as it sounded, I wondered, was this the answer I had been looking for? I had never been able to hear God talk back to me before. Maybe that would all change now. Maybe I could finally see God, hear him, feel him myself. "Dad, do you think one day I'll be able to see them too?" "Of course you will. It will take time, but if you have faith, nothing will be invisible to you." And so began my quest of faith, my quest to see these beings for myself, to see God. Over the next several months, my father shared with me his stories about his frequent encounters with the angels. He warned me never to tell another living soul, not even my mother. God had commanded him to keep his gift a secret from all except me. Car rides with my father became adventures, as he would describe his conversations with the beings. Usually they appeared to him during his solitary prayer walks, or while he was out anywhere by himself. Part of my father's gift was the ability to speak in angelic tongues, and it was in these tongues that he communicated with the angels. They would discuss the spiritual state of matters in the world, or go over details concerning my father's mission, or sometimes simply exchange words of wisdom. Each angel had a name and a distinct personality and appearance, all of which I have long forgotten. Most of these names I had never heard before, but once every so often my father would tell me how he had met Michael or Gabriel, or one of the other archangels. The vividness with which he reported his encounters to me was incredible. I felt as though I were there amongst the angels myself. The more I heard, the more urgently I wanted to see them with my own eyes. My father became my greatest hero. Obviously he was the most pious man I had ever known. Who else but the saints had ever been blessed with speaking with spiritual beings on a daily basis? I quickly became obsessed with gaining my father's abilities. If only I was less sinful, less worldly, a little more like my father. Time passed, and as my father began to meet with the angels more and more, I became more and more frustrated with myself for not being able to see them. But I learned to be patient. My father assured me that my time would come. One day, I too would look upon with Gabriel with my own two eyes. School let out for the summer, and that left more time than ever for spiritual growth. My father embarked upon his God-given mission, working and preaching at Christian events and concerts. He often met other believers who recognized the spiritual power within him, and they would have long theological discussions. Meanwhile, I sought to bring myself up to par spiritually by praying and reading my Bible for hours every day. The journey was difficult, and I often felt that I was getting nowhere, but I held on to hope. And then, everything changed. It was toward the end of the summer, and our family, including my parents, my two sisters, my mom's parents, and myself, headed down to Destin, Florida, for a week-long vacation. Due to our financial situation and the limited number of vehicles, we had decided that my mother and sisters would fly by plane to Destin while my grandparents drove down in one car and my father and I drove in another. The day of departure arrived, and my father and I climbed into our car with the bulk of the luggage, ready to embark upon the 14-hour drive to Florida. Naturally, it only took a few minutes before we began discussing spiritual matters. My father had more stories to share, and I listened eagerly. He spoke of his words with the angels, and described their splendor, and as he kept telling me about it all, I again experienced that feeling of inadequacy and the desire to be able to see the angels too. At one point I asked him what it was like to speak in tongues. "Oh, it's very simple," he told me. "You know when you're speaking their language because don't even have to try. The words just flow right out. That's because the Spirit of God is in you, inspiring the words. It's not really you who's talking at all. God is doing the talking through you." "I hope I'll be able to speak in tongues someday," I said, sighing. "You can right now, if you have faith," my father replied. "I can? You mean, really? What did Jesus say to his disciples? What if you have faith even a little as a mustard seed? You can move mountains." "Well, surely speaking in tongues is a lot easier than moving a mountain. Go on, try it." I was suddenly nervous. I didn't know what to do. Was this actually happening? Was I really about to try to speak an angelic language? After a long, awkward pause, I finally blurted out a jumbled pile of nonsense, just whatever came to my head. It was very short, maybe a sentence or two, if you could even call them sentences. I was embarrassed. I knew my father would laugh at me. "You did it. See?" my father exclaimed, much to my surprise. "You just spoke their language. All you need is faith. I'm proud of you, son." "I really did it then, huh?" I said, trying to hide the fact that I wasn't convinced. I knew I had just made those words up, there was no Spirit of God involved. But I didn't want to disappoint my father, so I played along. I even talked myself into half believing that maybe I had done it, maybe I was just too young to realize it. Regardless, I never made a second attempt after that day. The vacation in Florida was a disaster. My mother and father argued practically the entire time, and it made everyone else just miserable. Looking back, that trip was one of the lowest points in their whole marriage. Much of the fighting was due to the fact that my father was becoming increasingly out of touch with the family as he was focusing on his time with the angels. Of course, I was the only one who knew this, but everyone could tell something was going on in his head. I wished I could just blurt out the truth and defend my father. I wanted to end the fighting and tell everyone that he was actually trying to save souls, and that meanwhile they were angry at him for it. The vacation finally ended, and the family went their separate ways for the return journey. My father and I once again were in the car alone. This time, things were much different. At one point, my father told me that he had something very terrible to tell me. "I've been having more visions," he told me. "I've been talking to God, and God told me that your mother is going to die soon." I turned still as stone. The world froze. My brain turned numb. I had just been told that my mother was going to die. I tried to digest it. The idea was almost too preposterous to fit in my head. He went on to tell me that he did not know how she would die, but that he had been given a date. He could not share the date with me, however, but it was to happen soon, in accordance with God's plan. Meanwhile, God had shown my father the woman he would marry when my mother had died. She was a woman he had met at one of the Christian concerts he had worked at. She would become our new stepmother. The rest of the trip was spent recovering from the news. As horrible as it was, I knew God must have had a plan. If I was to one day experience Him fully, I would have to trust Him in all things. I tried to remember that when we arrived back at home. A week later I was in Oregon visiting my cousins right before school started. My father had told me that he would stay in touch with me. I still did not know when my mother's time would come, and I was filled with anxiety from the suspense. I tried to enjoy my last vacation of the summer, but it was hard when I had to live with the fact that my mother might die any day. Then, about halfway through my trip, I checked my phone before I went to bed one night and saw I had a voice message. It was from my father. My heart skipped a beat. Not knowing what to expect, I reluctantly picked up the phone and called voicemail. I listened to my father's message. I could hear the sadness in his voice. "Hey, it's Dad. I have some bad news. I know this will be hard to take in. Remember how I said that God told me your mother was going to die? Well, today was supposed to be the day. Son, your mother is still very much alive. All the visions, all the angels, all the conversations with God, none of that was real. I've gone to the doctor and found out that I suffer from bipolar disorder and severe hallucinations. I am mentally ill, and I've been prescribed medication. I'm so sorry I drug you through all my craziness. I guess we have a lot to talk about. Give me a call when you get a chance. Bye. I set down the phone. Then I collapsed onto my bed and began sobbing. 5 years later, I am finally writing down the full account of this story. Maybe it has touched you, maybe it has left you disappointed. My father still struggles with his mental illnesses today, but with counseling and medication he is able to live a happy, quiet life. He has spent many years rebuilding his relationship with God. He continues to pray and read the Bible daily, and he attends church every week. As for myself, I always find it hard to open up my Bible, and whenever I take a shot at saying a prayer, I usually feel like I'm still talking to the wall. Hollow. Found in www.creepypasta.org web link. Original author, Valley_Rat. I don't know what's worse, the screams or the silence that has fallen since then. Before, I felt like everything should be done to help others. Now, in my self-reflection, I don't know anymore. It was like any other day in the city. Sunny, crowded, and busy. I was walking to work at a large national bank, where I recently began an internship. I remember the day well because, besides the obvious fact that the world ended on this day, I had finally convinced myself to talk to the cute secretary across the hall from me. Things just seemed to be going my way that day. I walked to work every day, and the flow of traffic was straight my way. That's when the alarms sounded. There was a mass panic, as is expected. I watched as thousands of people ran in hysteria, all going absolutely nowhere. Some of the people ran for the subways, anything deep in the ground. There's only so many places to go, and as I stated before, people weren't getting very far. The only option I really had was to follow all those going into the subways. There were some military personnel on the corridor instructing us down the tunnel, wearing full military gas suits like they were equipped for some sort of bio-air attack. You couldn't see their faces at all, and they looked ominous. Some people were crying and the children were screaming as their parents dragged them into the ever-darkening tunnel. It must have been a few hours that I walked in darkness with crowds of people before more military personnel, dressed in similar attire as described before, signaled us to turn left into a behemoth of a vault. The characters N77R2D80F were written across some of the steel work. I was lucky enough to have gotten in because I heard gunshots after walking through the metal frames and the large bronze-looking doors were shut behind us. More screams could be heard outside and more gunshots. Things got quiet outside after a few minutes. The explosions began around 15 minutes later. The sound was deafening and the ground shook like the gods themselves were trying to kill us. The children continued to scream through it all and continued long after. The thing that disturbed me the most was the lack of noise outside. Things remained quiet in the vault for the next few days. People talked about what it was that might have happened on the outside, and the general consensus was that a nuclear explosion had detonated on the surface. It was a miracle that we were still all alive, to be honest. There was a small cafeteria for us, but it was obviously overwhelmed by the amount of refugees here. The food rations were fairly small and seemed inhumane, though we all knew there wasn't enough to go around. It was around the third or fourth day that noises began to come from outside of the vault. The soldiers were instructed by their superiors not to open the doors for any reason, and I think we were all thankful for it. None of us wanted to see what was on the other side, especially now when we heard their pleas. "We know you're in there. You have to let us in. Help us. We're dying out here, do something. For the love of God, help." Their cries went on for around 3 hours before gunshots sounded on the other side of the door. I don't want to know who those shots came from, but we were all glad for the quiet. After a week more, the voices were back. This time they cursed and threatened us all on the inside. They went on to say that once they were on the inside, they'd eat our flesh and suck the marrow from our bones like a straw. I tried not to let it get to me, but it wasn't working. The voices followed me into my dreams and caused me horrible nightmares. I dreamt I was on the outside in the probably leveled city, being chased by subhumans trying to eat me. I know they're just dreams, but who knows if that's too far off from reality. Recently the leaders of the vault had all agreed that our rations would be halved. There was protest and a small faction tried to take the cafeteria, but they were all shot. I've begun hoarding the food I've gotten in my bag for work. Like I said, there's not a lot, but I stow away what I can when I can. They're inside the vault, and they're not human. I caught a glimpse of them as I ran through the corridors, and those things are not humans. They have horrible green glowing eyes, and their hairless skin is yellow. I locked eyes with one of them, and in that moment I felt the hatred he, or it, felt for me. A step, 2 steps, and then finally a burst of rounds into his head from his left. I didn't stop to wait and greet my savior. I ran. I ran as fast and as hard as I could run. You'll probably think me a coward for what I'm about to say next, but I don't care. I arrived in the cafeteria and went straight for the kitchen. Breakfast was just being served, so one of the storerooms wasn't locked up, and no one was around. I locked the giant door behind me and listened to the carnage outside of my door. Some shots continued to ring throughout the next couple hours, and were silenced. I spent my time taking stock of what food I had, and it was enough to survive for, let's just say, a hell of a long time. A soldier lay inside near the door with his rifle to his front, and his sidearm still holstered. I grabbed the sidearm and pocketed it. I have been in this room for longer than I can keep track. By the amount of cans stacked against the wall, I can only guess a month. The corpse in the room began to rot a long time ago, and the stench is horrendous. It fills my nostrils day and night. The worst of it is they know I'm here. They know I've locked myself in this room and they keep telling me I am going to die here. I am going to die in this room. This is the place. They whisper to me in my sleep that they'll peel my eyelids off of my head and rip my fingers off one by one. I spend the days curled up in the corner, watching the man rot, wishing my hell would end. I've thought to myself many times that I could just shoot myself in the temple and then this nightmare would go away. The food is dwindling, and the idea is more and more tempting. Those hollow things call my name. In my loneliness I told them who I was. They tell me to open the door and it'll all be over. Those hollow, unhuman things tell me to end it. End the torture on my own terms. They got one thing right. Tomorrow, when I wake up, I'm ending it on my own terms. Good night everyone.